Right, good afternoon. My name is Tim McKay, and I am the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Physics, Astronomy, and Education. I'm also the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this event here this afternoon. This is part of the College and Beyond 2 Liberal Arts and Life Public Colloquium season for the new year. And welcome to you and welcome back to some of you who've been to some of these events before. Today we gather to consider the liberal arts in 2021, addressing global challenges. This afternoon's conversation will feature a panel of 4 fantastic speakers who I'm fortunate enough to have as colleagues here at the University of Michigan. When we began to think about this colloquium series in early 2020, a year ago, we had little idea what the year would hold, or of the array of emergent and immediate challenges we would face. That said, every crisis of the past year has roots in deep and persistent global failures of society, in racism and oppression, in inequality and climate change, and in the way all of these threaten the health and well-being of our community. The past year has brought these societal failures to the minds and vision of all young people in the world in really vivid ways. They know now, maybe more than ever, that it is their task to address these challenges. It is our responsibility to prepare them to participate fully and effectively in every aspect of this work. It's a daunting task. Fortunately, though, we have a powerful tool at our disposal. Over the last 130 years or so, history has shown that a liberal arts education can create the kind of participatory readiness we seek. It can get people ready to face challenges like this. Our goal in today's conversation is to think together about how to adapt this always evolving model to prepare students for today's global challenges. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity today to think through these topics with you and with our speakers. I'll say more about those speakers in just a minute. This event is part of a year-long series exploring the values, dimensions, and outcomes of liberal arts education. In the fall term, we began this exploration with a wide-ranging and engaging conversation among a set of liberal arts college deans about what they want to know about liberal arts education, which was moderated by our own LS&A Dean, Ann Curzan. That event was followed by 3 seminars focused on measuring the liberal arts, each featuring a path-breaking project seeking to develop and refine measures of undergraduate education, and especially its liberal arts components, ultimately to determine their impact on the present and future lives of students. Later this term, on February 26th, these seminars on measurement will resume with a session focused on using multiple forms of data to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in liberal arts education. This too will have a great set of speakers and be moderated by Dr. Carson Bird, the Faculty Director of Research Initiatives at the National Center for Institutional Diversity here at Michigan. The series will conclude in April with a plenary session on how to make the case for liberal education, again, moderated by Dean Curzan. So how do we make the case for liberal education? The general benefits of college education are numerous and well documented. It's associated with a wide range of economic and social and personal and health outcomes. But exactly how a college transforms a student's life and which aspects of the experience are critical to this transformation is less well understood. Champions of the liberal arts, like me, claim that broad, deep, and various education of the kind you get in the liberal arts creates participatory readiness. It prepares students for deep and effective engagement in civic and political life, for creative self-expression and imaginative world-making, for rewarding relationships in spaces which are intimate, personal, professional, and civic. And of course, it also prepares them for breadwinning work. The College and Beyond 2 project aims to develop quantitative metrics, and it is collecting rich administrative and survey data to explore connections between what happens in college and the lives we lead beyond. It also provides us with insight into how undergraduate education can be improved so that it best serves students and society. And if you want to learn more about this project in particular, the host project for this series, I invite you to join us in another seminar on March 19th, when researchers from our College and Beyond 2 team will take the stage to share some of our latest results. This project and the Colloquium series are both generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and I want to gratefully acknowledge their support. I also want to thank some series co-sponsors here at the University of Michigan, including the National Center for Institutional Diversity, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, the College of Engineering, the Education Policy Initiative at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the School of Education, and of course, my own College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. And I want to take a moment, though, to specially thank our session organizers this afternoon, Jenny Brady and Shannon Davis. If you've ever tried to put on a large event of your own, you know how much effort it takes, and they've done a great job of preparing us for it. One last thing before I introduce our speakers, let me give you a few details about how today's session will proceed. We're going to begin with each panelist making brief remarks, and then we will have time for discussion among the panelists as well as questions from you. A live transcript is being generated through Zoom, and if you click on the closed caption, the CC button at the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to view subtitles. This event is also being recorded and will be posted on the series website in the near future. Videos of all the past events are also available on there. And if you're on social media and tweeting about today's event, please consider using the hashtag CollegeandBeyondII, College and Beyond 2 hashtag in your posts so that we can keep it. All right. It is a very great pleasure to introduce our speakers today, and I'm going to do so briefly so that we can turn to their remarks and the conversation that will follow. There are longer biographies of all of our speakers listing their many accomplishments linked on the Colloquium series website. Okay, so our first speaker today will be Angela Dillard. Dr. Dillard is the Richard A. Meisler Collegiate Professor of Afro-American and African Studies, History, and the Residential College. She was the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education in the College of LS&A from 2015 to 2019. And today she's going to talk to us about ways in which a liberal arts education prepares students to address the challenge of racism in society. To do this, she'll draw a little bit on questions and insights which emerged from a recent review of LS&A's race and ethnicity requirement, which she led that review during her time as Associate Dean. Our second speaker today will be Earl Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the director of the Center for Social Solutions. He's also the Thomas C. Holt Distinguished University Professor of History, Afro-American and African Studies, and Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Dr. Lewis is also the President Emeritus of the Mellon Foundation. And his remarks today will focus on inequality in its many forms and how a liberal arts education might prepare students to work for equity in society. Our third speaker, Brahmar Mukherjee, is the John D. Kalbfleisch Collegiate Professor, Chair of the Department of Biostatistics, and Professor of Epidemiology and Global Public Health at the University of Michigan. In addition, she's a core faculty member in the Michigan Institute of Data Science and serves as the Associate Director for Quantitative Data Sciences at the University of Michigan's Rogel Cancer Center. She will be helping us think about global health challenges and their implications for liberal arts education in her remarks today. And finally, our fourth speaker will be Chris Paulsen, the Associate Dean for Natural Sciences in LS&A, as well as the Henry Pollack Collegiate Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences and Climate and Space Sciences. Chris's research group focuses on large-scale climate change throughout Earth's history, and he'll speak to us today about climate change and how we might prepare liberal arts students to address the challenges of climate change in the future. So welcome to all of our presenters. I'm really thrilled that you're all here with us today. It's an honor to be able to share the stage with you. I am also eager to get started, and Dr. Dillard will begin. So Angela, I will turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Tim. I'm really happy to be here and to be speaking with such great colleagues on such weighty and important topics. So over the past several years, I've had numerous opportunities to reflect on the power of a liberal arts curriculum and how and why it matters to include coursework on race, racism, ethnic intolerance, and discrimination that also aspires to be anti-racist in nature. In fact, I'll say up front that from my perspective, there are a few global and national challenges that are not either touched by histories of discrimination and exclusion based on race or other forms of marginalization, or made exponentially worse because of the lingering effects of racism. This is a reality that a couple of generations now of student activists and faculty allies have recognized and fought for. This was true in the late 1980s when graduate students, undergrads, and allied faculty here at Michigan responded to an upsurge of racism on our campus and put forth an affirmative argument about the importance of anti-racist education. What became the race and ethnicity college degree requirement for our College of Literature, Science, and the Arts was the result. It was true in this last major was true as well in the last major wave of campus-based student protests, roughly 2013 to 2016, which included the hashtag BBUM, being Black at the University of Michigan, and walkouts and hunger strikes at Ms. U. Across campuses, the top 5 student protest demands almost invariably included calls for more faculty diversity and calls for more required courses on race and racism. And I think this sense that this has to be part of the curriculum will continue to be the case in the wake of the summer 2020 that witnessed massive national and international protests against police brutality and for Black lives in the midst of a pandemic that has so grossly exposed racial and ethnic disparities. As LSA's race and ethnicity requirement passes its 30th anniversary, insistence that it also become more forcefully oriented towards anti-racism is a safe bet. Our R&E, as it's colloquially known here, already has a global component and lives across the curriculum in humanities and social science departments. Courses serving the requirement must incorporate 3 dimensions. 1, the meaning of race, ethnicity, and racism. 2, racial and ethnic intolerance and resulting inequality as it occurs in the United States or elsewhere. And 3, comparisons of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, social class, or gender. And that wording was amended in 2016 after our college-wide review to read comparisons of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, social class, gender, and gender identity, ability/disability status, sexual orientation, or national origin. Interestingly, this was not exactly what student activists in the late 1980s had in mind. And a number of compromises had to be made on the road to faculty approval in 1990. Proponents of the requirement had to specify that to satisfy the requirement, a course would have to, quote, devote substantial, but not necessarily exclusive attention to the required content. And that while, quote, many of these courses will focus on the United States, it was not required that they do so. While many students, undergraduates now on our campuses, would prefer a requirement based in the contemporary US, I think my faculty colleagues have been right that it can't just be about the here and the now. It also needs to be about the then and the there. That is, about history and about other parts of the world, if we are to understand that racism is a trans-historical problem and a global phenomenon. It may, in fact, maybe what we need is more attention to non-Western perspectives, especially those that reject or at least temper the narcissism of Western-centric worldviews, particularly those that claim universality in ways that are starting to feel increasingly shop-worn. After all, the often interconnected global struggles against white supremacy have generated a vast archive of political, social, economic, and artistic thought, one that is often critical of Western political and economic arrangements, and one that offers alternative visions of human coexistence on a fragile planet. We might use this as a moment to think as expansively as possible about what race and ethnicity requirements in anti-racist education might entail in this moment, while also being attentive to the finer points of on-the-ground implementation. And I'll just say a few things about that in the time I have left. Clarifying teaching and learning goals will probably help. At Michigan, the precise learning goals of the R&E requirement were left strategically vague, in order to get the requirement passed. Over the years, that decision compounded issues around assessment and accountability on the one hand, and student expectations on the other. It's been a real shortcoming, I think, for us here. While clear learning goals don't necessarily prevent conflicts, they can help to provide a common language through which all parties, students, professors, administrators, can temper their own expectations and desires. If nothing else, such goals can be instrumental in assessing whether courses truly satisfy these kinds of requirements and the high bar that anti-racism sets. Embracing more and better faculty-driven assessment feels equally essential to being able to make evidence-based cases for how anti-racist education enhances learning within a liberal arts core. Clearer learning goals and assessment might also support stronger pedagogical focuses. What is most important about these requirements may not be who teaches them, what topics and disciplines they incorporate, what level they're offered at, how many credit hours they generate. In the end, it might be the pedagogy that matters the most. Teaching about race, racism, and anti-racism involves skills-based practices that often challenge the limits of our pedagogical training. In addition to content expertise, instructors also need facilitation and classroom management skills to navigate charge dynamics and to support dialogue, engagement, and critical self-reflection. I think this part of the curriculum also needs approaches to education that are more corporate in nature, that is, more team-based and intergenerational, more rooted in communities of practice, less lonely for individual instructors, and more supported by departmental and even interdepartmental infrastructures. To be truly transformative and effective, anti-racist education needs to be a shared commitment and a collective responsibility in which faculty have the resources that they need to teach and our students have what they need to learn. Finally, I think this level of commitment and infrastructure is essential because of what a truly committed approach to anti-racist education might require. An approach that is global in ways that decenter an uncritical acceptance of Western assumptions, that draws on anti-colonial movements and thinkers, that's feminist, attentive to the roles of non-elite actors, and as Pankaj Mishra argues in a recent piece in the New York Review of Books, one that accepts that we all might have some unlearning and relearning to do in recognition that fundamental assumptions about the inferiority of non-white peoples have tainted much of our previous knowledge and analysis about our past, our present, and our future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Angela, for this great wisdom. There's lots of ideas in that. I'm making notes about questions here while you're going on that we can discuss later when we come back. So we're going to turn now to our next speaker, Earl Lewis, who will share some of his thoughts about inequality.
So let me start a conversation about inequality by actually talking about the liberal arts first, and moving from there to a point about inequality. As Tim noted, I had the privilege of serving as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for 5 years. So the College and Beyond 2 project started on my desk a few years ago, and it's lovely to see it reach this point of execution and development. And I go back to that point because I can remember sitting in New York circa 2014, 15, surrounded by colleagues as we puzzled over the future of the liberal arts. And there were articles and books coming out one after the other, bemoaning, decrying, and worrying about the future of the liberal arts. My colleague, Gene Tobin, then pulled out an essay that had been written a generation before, where he noted that we had prematurely proclaimed the death of liberal arts more than once in American history. And it was important for us to sort of step back and take a look. And I've been sitting on that notion of what it means to actually think about the liberal arts more generally. And a year ago, I published a piece in Deathless, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, calling for a 2.0 version of the liberal arts and the liberal arts in the nation's service. For those of you who are aware of the LEAP program by AAC&U, which talked about the liberal arts in the nation's service, and why that was important, it sort of made me think, what do we need to be considering in today's world to make sure that the liberal arts indeed reach and achieve the goals and aspirations that were nicely sketched by Angela a few minutes ago, and that we begin to redesign the ways in which we deploy our resources. I mean, one of my failures as president of the Mellon Foundation was my inability to get any college, university president or provost to take money from us to redesign their version of the liberal arts whole cloth. And I said, I'll give you all the money. It's a whiteboard exercise. I'll redesign it for the next 25 years rather than the last 100 years. And it was $1 that was hard to give away. And I had several friends and colleagues who said to me, Earl, we're happy to be second. That was a telling moment because it said that in some ways we were both comfortable with where we are and fearful of what we didn't know and hesitant to embrace a change that in and of itself may perhaps not be an improvement. So this 2.0 version, then I ended up arguing in this piece, and I still think is pertinent today, is looking to the future, and inequality is a natural place to actually begin this conversation. What is the purpose of an education? And as we think about it, what's the contract that we're signing with ourselves as instructors and faculty and the students who actually enroll in our class? And in some ways, I would argue that part of our challenge in the next 25 to 30 years is to figure out how to make sure we not only continue to educate deeply and broadly, but that we are also preparing our students to be both robot ready and robot proof. That in a way that the technologies that have been developed and have been harnessed will continue to be so. We need to make sure that our students have multiple literacies to be able to really function well in that world, particularly if we're thinking about them as not just students, but as scholar citizens, which was sort of the framing construct, Tim, that you started with. So what do we need to do? Let's use inequality as an example. Could you imagine then in this world where they're robot ready and robot proof, that in the first year they get this broad sort of base exposure to concepts and key ideas, important moments in history and sociology and society, in a way to actually begin to help them to understand what are the questions that have been asked, how were those questions formulated, how do they connect one to another? And then years 2 and 3, where they actually then began to go vertically into a subject area, where they're actually working on that subject in some real ways, where they actually gain some version of, if not just familiarity with the materials, but some semblance of expertise. But then by year 4, it's no longer satisfactory just to be in the classroom. They're actually taking that work and begin to really work on it in real time on real projects that are, as we all know, that are problem-based, and which means that they are cumbersome and sometimes don't yield the results that we anticipate, but from them, both successes and failures, we learn. And so inequality then becomes an important way of thinking about this. If we look at and imagine the world that's been described, McKinsey issued a series of reports a few years ago that projected that by 2030, due to automation and technological change, upwards of 400 million people worldwide would actually lose their means of employment. That's significant. They went on to suggest that 39 to 54 million of those folks would be in the United States. So if we think about just those two numbers, or excessive numbers, 400 million globally, 39 to 54 million in the United States, and just roll back the clock to a few weeks ago and trying to figure out then where the anxiety that we saw on the faces of other Americans, was that about inequality? Was it, to Angela's earlier point, about some aspects of race and racism? Was it about a sense of insecurity in the world that didn't promise them and can't promise them the future that they think they deserve, let alone were born into? I mean, how do we begin to actually tease out, I mean, just with those sets of numbers, the whole question of inequality? And then we move from that to the next example and say, okay, it's not only that, but we actually have a history here. How do we begin to talk about the relationship between inequality and seasons of inequality? And so What do we do with the story of slavery? How do we begin to situate 1619 as a founding date in American history rather than 1776? And I won't get into the politics of those 2 dates at this particular moment. But they both sort of represent flashpoints in the ways in recent days of how we talk about not just history, but in some ways how we actually begin to even frame equality and inequality. And so inequality has as its twin equality, and how do we actually think about the relationship between the two? How do we set this up as a real problem? In real terms, it means then that I think for liberal arts education, it comes back to both how we design the curriculum, but also how we actually then create opportunities for students to engage in exploration and discovery, and to be able to actually link those discoveries in new ways. I'll end with an example. It's only one example, but the University of Redlands in California, in their honors college, requires all of their students to actually engage in a series of explorations during their college stay. But in their sophomore year, they essentially sign a contract with themselves and with faculty in the college and with other students that they're going to do A, B, C, and D. And then they go through that over the next 2-3 years. By the end of their fourth year, they actually write a paper, but it's not unlike any other senior thesis that I've ever seen. They actually write a paper that integrates everything they have learned, every experience they've had, and then that paper is actually reviewed. It's peer reviewed by other students and by faculty. And so there's this exchange in a way where they're making sure that at the end of this 4-year period, that it's not just the design I talked about earlier, where broad knowledge in the first year, vertical deep knowledge in years 2 and 3, and then applied knowledge in years 4. It also then is sealed in a way where they can actually talk about how all of these pieces integrate. I mean, imagine that then if the theme is inequality, or if the theme is racism. And in part, I think the challenge for us as we look to the future and talk about being robot ready and robot proof is to make sure and understand that the students that we're educating now and preparing for their roles in society, those students will not just change careers, but will change full jobs 8 or 10 times based on most projections. What we need is not to make sure they have so much a certain kind of domain knowledge, is the ability to figure out what questions to be asked, how to actually puzzle over those questions, how to actually continue to explore them over a period of time, and how to tell the good from the bad, the junk from what is valuable. I mean, that in a way becomes all the more important as we think about then the more weightier topics like inequality. So let me pause for the next few minutes and we can come back to this.
All right, great. Thank you so much for those comments. I mean, the questions about the overall structure of liberal arts education is one of the ways we can go at this, thinking about experiences students might have in or out of the class. I hope we'll have some time to talk about that as well as we go on. So we're going to turn to you now, Dr. Mukherjee, to talk a little bit about global health and how we might prepare people to face those challenges.
Thank you so much, Tim. I apologize because I have been having some trouble with my voice since morning. I was really looking forward to screaming at this seminar and talking about bringing some ambition and aspiration to the room, but my voice did not cooperate. But thank you, Tim, for this opportunity. And thanks to my fellow panelists for their wonderful remarks. I grew up in India in a very different culture where I was forced to declare my major at the age of 18. And by mistake, I chose statistics and I had to stick with it because I had no choice to change. So I would have to give you a little bit context of what I understand by liberal arts education in my upbringing and how that has helped me to navigate some of the global health projects that I have been working on. So I grew up as a profound admirer and follower of mathematics and statistics in a house full of actors, writers, and English professors. While my erudite thespian father made sure that I read the magnificent complete works of Shakespeare, that I knew I was expected to identify quotes randomly tossed at me from Chomsky and Umberto Eco, and that I had the opportunity to visit esoteric theatrical performances from Brecht to Beckett, I could never make him study the theory of relativity, the second law of thermodynamics, or appreciate the beauty of the De Moivre-Laplace theorem. The challenge of making even my own parents understand what I do for a living and why modeling disease processes across the globe is so exciting to me has made me question oftentimes what is liberal arts education. If the pillars of liberal arts are defined as natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, and art, why understanding mathematics and data science is not considered more essential to our curriculum? Understanding the logical foundation of reasoning and the axioms of mathematics can help a historian or a playwright frame their thinking, just like the knowledge of history can help a mathematician to identify the important problems for the future. So the psychology of transcendence and discovery is common to both streams. But in India and education, I saw a very segregated version of the education. So I often wondered, sitting in my own couch in India, that why is not liberal arts education called liberal sciences education? What would liberal sciences education look like? So I am a big fan of Tolstoy, and he said in an essay on the moral responsibility of art, art is not a pleasure, a solace, or an amusement. Art is a great matter. Art is an organ of human life, transmitting man's reasonable perception into feeling. And true science should indicate the various methods of applying this consciousness to life. I really like the definition of science, that applying this consciousness to life. So I always search for this holistic, unbounded, infinite continuum between the art and sciences in what liberal arts education is supposed to teach us. However, I felt sometimes, particularly being a math and stat major for the last 30 years, I agree with C.P. Snow, the British intellectual, who said the two cultures, and also not knowing the second law of thermodynamics or not knowing the basic concepts like mass and acceleration is not considered as much of an illiteracy in the popular culture. So in the past year, my parents actually started understanding some of my work. Through my modeling of the COVID-19 data in India, they are probably under the worldwide Fauci learning effect. Data consumption and literacy has become a necessity for us through this global pandemic. In making decisions about personal prevention, about choosing a vaccine, about our own personal health and the health of our loved ones. Terms like phase 3 double-blind, multi-center, randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trials have become a common household phrase. So the moment has forced us to learn, to adapt our learning to things that were considered obscure and was perhaps perceived as redundant by many, including my favorite, the theory of chance and randomization. This time has also emphasized for us more than ever that our health is interconnected. Unless we eradicate this virus from every country in the world and learn how to manage this public health crisis, we cannot be free from the shadows and fear of COVID. We have also come to recognize that the common inequity and social justice ethical issues that the pandemic has underscored worldwide is just not going to be solved by medicine or public health alone. We really need an approach grounded in all aspects of human knowledge to improve global equity and global health. In this moment of pause and reflection, we here in this virtual room are assessing how do we support, encourage, nurture our students to learn an assortment of skills instead of a narrow specific skill. Are we good at producing hedgehogs and we are in search of foxes? In this changing world where technology, economics, job sectors, knowledge are constantly evolving and shifting, education moves far beyond the 4 years of college. How can we teach the students to learn on their own? How do we pick the right elasticity of our stretching band for learning? I feel we have focused too much on a performative culture rather than a provocative culture. In closing, I really want to discuss with you today, how can we set ourselves and our students to venture out like Ulysses, on a journey beset with dangers and uncertainties. Adversity can bring out the worst as well as the best in all of us. A period of crisis is when the best and the brightest among us come together to not only meet the challenge, but also to find innovations that serve us long after the storm blows over. Perhaps that moment has come for us to promote some radical changes in our university education system, which will make our students be better teachers for themselves lifelong. After all, we have come to recognize through a very difficult process that it is our common humanity across the globe that binds us beyond our classrooms, beyond our careers, and beyond our disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating insight into what liberal arts education doesn't and perhaps doesn't sometimes do for people. That's certainly one of the things we're working to address in our current College and Beyond 2 project. I love the image of sending students out as Ulysses to travel between Scylla and Charybdis and hopefully make it home one day at the end of their lives. So we'll be thinking about that image. We're going to turn to our final speaker now, to Chris Paulsen, who will tell us a little bit about some of his thoughts about how we might prepare students to address truly global change, climate change issues.
Thanks, Tim. It's lovely to go last so I can pick up and trail themes that were already communicated before. So I'm going to use this opportunity to reflect on how liberal arts education prepares our students to face climate change. And I would say at the outset that I think a liberal arts education is in many ways perfectly suited to prepare our students for global challenges like climate change. Climate change is a complex, evolving, and interdisciplinary issue. The science of climate change is highly technical and draws on evidence that by its nature is noisy and complicated. The solutions are both imperfect and come at high costs that are not equally distributed. And the impacts of climate change are insidious and differentially felt across society and the world and affect those who are least equipped to deal with it. So to understand and make informed decisions about climate change requires a broad education that imparts both analytical and flexible thinking and that fosters empathy and a sense of shared responsibility and commitment. A liberal arts education fits this call. In fact, my critique of how the liberal arts prepares students to face global climate change, is that the preparation isn't liberal sciencey enough. I don't think it's as effective or as inclusive as it could be. The first reason is that our curriculum and programming with regards to climate change hasn't caught up with our reality. We teach climate change largely, not entirely, but largely through a disciplinary lens without much coordination or diffusion between disciplines. We've known climate change is a global problem caused by humans for more than 40 years. However, for most of those 40 years, even though the physics were well known and incontrovertible, our focus was on convincing a dubious society that the Earth was warming and that we are responsible for that warming. As a consequence, climate change has been taught primarily as a science issue in Earth and atmospheric science departments. As CO2 levels have continued to rise, warming has become unequivocal and IPCC statements more strident, the conversation has expanded to include engineering and the social sciences, mainly public policy and economics, in an attempt to find solutions to reduce carbon emissions. More recently, starting with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, but really gaining steam in the last 5 years as climate impacts, here I'm thinking of hurricanes, heat waves, forest fires, poor air quality events, have become more frequent and devastating, and the disproportionate effect of these impacts on historically marginalized, underserved, and poor communities have been recognized. Climate change has rightfully emerged as a climate justice issue. There's also a growing realization that we can't tech our way out of this. The silver bullets that were supposed to save us, carbon sequestration, carbon neutral electrification, geoengineering, are now recognized to be only partial solutions. If we want to avoid catastrophic loss of glaciers and biodiversity and societal disruption, we're going to have to make some decisions as a society that puts sustainability above growth and to value our ecosystems for their inherent worth rather than as a commodity. This raises ethical and philosophical issues and concerns that generally have not been considered in our standard teaching of climate change. So if there's a shortcoming in the way that liberal arts education educates our students when it comes to climate change, it's that it's largely taught through a disciplinary focus rather than a holistic interdisciplinary issue. An interdisciplinary treatment would engage and permeate a broad swath of disciplines, the earth sciences, ecology, physics, psychology, philosophy, history, religion, economics, and political science through a jointly taught and well-coordinated sequence of courses. In addition, these courses would focus on building agency and giving students experiences that lead them to have capacity to address climate change. An important side effect of teaching climate change through a disciplinary lens is that it limits the students who take and are exposed to these courses and ideas. If I don't consider myself a science student, it's unlikely that I'll enroll in a 300 level earth science course on climate change, especially if that course had any prerequisites. So to wrap up, I think there is an opportunity to consider how we provide programming around global challenges like climate change to provide a truly integrated experience that more fully takes advantage of the breadth that a liberal arts education offers. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. We're going to turn now to some collective conversation. So we're going to bring everyone back to the screen. As we begin this conversation, I want to encourage our audience to raise questions that you might have or responses that you might have to what any of our panelists have said, or feel free to bring in completely new topics. You can do that by using the Q&A tab that's at the bottom. So if you start asking questions there as we go on, I'll be monitoring that and I will feed forward some of those questions to our speakers as they come in. So do please participate. It's very important for us that we should be sure to hear from you as well. I'll invite all of our panelists back to the screen now. So once they're up here with me, I'm gonna see if we can't have some interaction among ourselves. So I want to ask each of you to think about responses that you might have for the other panelists that you just heard from. Does anyone want to jump in and provide some reaction?
I'll jump in. They were great, and it comes back to trying. I mean, Chris's last point says starting there is beginning to try to figure out then how do we where do we start the redesign? So is the redesign with the unit, the department? I mean, so we created these structures from the end of the 19th century that continue to followed us through the 20th century into the 21st century. And so are we at a radical moment in the construction of American higher education where we actually may need to move beyond something called departments and disciplines, where it may be that units like centers and institutes may be where we want to house people because they're actually working in theory, at the very least, in a collaborative way across multidisciplinary, if not interdisciplinary collectives to work on questions, if not problems. It's just fascinating to sort of sit here in 2021 and I'll say something about my own age now, because some of these questions were on the table the first time I came to University of Michigan as a faculty member in 1989. And I'm sort of 30 years later, we're still wrestling with the basic organization to be able to do the kind of work that I think is absolutely important. I'm about to submit a little book where I argue that we need to move beyond STEM to something called HEATS, which combines the humanities, engineering, arts, technology, and sciences as a way to begin to integrate the kind of learning that is being suggested. But I'll keep coming back to the structure that we created for ourselves. Anyway, so I'll be provocative in that way and ask, and do we start there? Are we prepared to start there?
Earl, I'll just follow up on that. I appreciate that you made that comment because I wasn't brave enough to make that comment in my remarks. I stopped myself from suggesting that the structure might be broken. I wasn't thinking of departments specifically, but I was thinking about majors, for example. And how constrained students are in their coursework and in their thinking by their disciplinary major. I also think that there's room and there should be a lot more incentive for joint courses taught between faculty in different departments as well. So I think there are multiple ways that we can make these courses more multidisciplinary and more consequential to the global challenges that we're discussing today.
So I'll jump in on a provocative note and kind of wonder out loud. And I've been kind of noodling around with this for a while, so I really welcome this opportunity. To think about how we might design based on things that are fragile. A sector in higher ed that's a bit fragile, a planet that's fragile, interpersonal relationships that seem increasingly fragile, political systems, some founded on notions of liberal democracy that are really, pretty fragile right now. So it seems to me that a lot of the assumptions behind the liberal arts were, a bit of exceptionalism, a bit triumphant, a bit, from a position of power. Here's how you ought to educate the next generation of leaders. So if you turn that around and have some of the assumptions about fragility, would you start to design some of these things differently? I mean, so what would happen if you just change some of the underlying assumptions in this moment and kind of rethink some of the structures that might need to change as the assumptions change?
At the core of the structure of a liberal education right now is this kind of combination of breadth and depth. And we have built a system where most of the faculty focus on the depth part. They're in a department, they think about a discipline, they teach, that's what they do. And as we ask our students to engage in breadth, that breadth is a sampling breadth. They go to different disciplines and get a little bit of each discipline. It isn't an integrative breadth where we draw things truly together. We force that, only the students get to do that thinking. And so I think there is a structural problem in the way we set up our system, that if we encouraged, enabled, required our faculty to engage in collective effort. I know that Angela earlier on mentioned the loneliness of teaching, that we typically don't work together on how we educate students as much as we might. And that can be clearly part of this, that if we're working together on the way we educate students, we're not as lonely, but we're also doing this integrative work then. Chris, Angela, that right now our systems don't support that very well. In fact, they quite discourage it. We've made it almost impossible for people to teach across lines and meet all the bureaucratic requirements of the institution. So we have clearly work to do there.
So the only comment I would make is that, yes, we need to recognize our original sins. And what is the point of always scratching the surface for symptoms rather than penetrating and going to the root cause why this has not happened? As Earl mentioned, for 30 years, we have been talking about these same things. And so I think it's probably really the time has come where we take some restorative, reparative sort of measures that gets to the root cause, not just analyze the symptoms all the time.
Yeah. Any other integrative comments people want to bring up before we turn to some of the questions from the audience?
I guess the other, go ahead,
Sorry, Chris. No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the other theme that I heard you bring up was, or I think I did, is having doing activities that matter. Engaging students in real world activities, and we have faculty that do this. I'm really impressed with a colleague, Adam Simon, who had a course where the intent of the course was to find a way to make the University of Michigan carbon neutral. And that is a fantastic exercise, provides the students great agency to think about this issue. We need more of that. We're very good about telling them the problem and maybe giving them the principles, but we're not as good about asking them to solve it. And I think that teaching them and giving them the confidence to solve these issues would be tremendous, and also maybe possibly make them, as Tim said earlier, maybe help them in breadwinning and find employment as well.
I was going to follow the same thread. I mean, going back 30, 35 years ago, it was my undergraduate students and graduate students who taught me the importance of actually doing something that mattered. I mean, they would say that to me more often than not. It's like, you know, Professor Lewis, this is fine, but in the end of the day, this has to be, it has to matter for something other than finishing an assignment or earning a degree. And I have to have a way to explain to myself and my community why it is I've invested in this kind of effort to do, and you sort of fill in the sentence there. And to be honest, when I decided to come back 2 years ago and we created the Center for Social Solutions, we named it intentionally, and it was going to not just study problems, but we actually going to be working to try to come up with solutions. But in some ways, I was carrying forward an investment that was made in me by my students who were trying to educate me 30, 35 years ago, and that this should be part of what the university provides for them as well as us. I mean, that is those of us who are faculty and administrators at various points, but also for the ways in which we think about the overall design. And you know, I remain optimistic, even as I also remain guarded.
So one thing I've been reflecting on in hearing this conversation is about the interplay between the formal parts of an undergraduate education in a liberal arts institution and the informal parts of their education. So we create these once upon a time residential education experiences because we believe it's so essential to bring people together into a community so they can interact both formally and informally during the period that they're on campus. I know that many students reflect on how some of the most important things that they learn don't take place in the classroom, but take place outside the classroom. A common mode of that kind of learning takes place within still structured activities. Could be student organizations that they might participate in, projects that they join that are framed for them. So let's talk a little bit first about that kind of structured extracurricular activity that might prepare students to be real change agents in the world. Sometimes these structures are about preparing them pretty close to sort of career-oriented things, but sometimes it's really more about change. I know that we have a program in undergrad ed that you used to work with a lot, Angela. Do you want to say anything about Optimize and sort of how it approaches giving students the chance to do this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great program. It runs an annual social innovation challenge. It fields teams, it provides mentoring, and the mentoring aspects are really incredible. And I'm always just completely blown away. If undergraduates ask people, they will give enormous amounts of their time and energy to helping them realize a vision, ask the right questions, do the right kind of analyses to be able to get an idea or a project off the ground. So at the end of the academic year, there are people who win, and then the program helps to fund them to be able to make their project, their idea, a reality. But what's really interesting is that it's really kind of ultimately not about winning so much as being a member of this community, to be around other young people who kind of, have been told, you don't have to wait to change the world. Why not you? Why not now? Jump into this kind of work. And it mobilizes all of these tools from the liberal arts. I mean, I used to comment on that and they would just kind of shoo me away because that's not the point for them. But that's absolutely what's happening. And the way that they mobilize learning across the curriculum and classes, reaching out to faculty, talking with each other. I mean, it's a really exciting model. And sometimes the leadership of the program says, that in the future, this is going to be college, that this will just be what college is, doing these kinds of projects, getting these kinds of initiatives off the ground, doing that kind of problem solving. So I don't know, if I'm willing to follow them down, that route completely. But I think they're onto something about this as a style of education. And then I'll just say, and Tim, I know we've talked about this, we've got to find a better way of making this legible, both to the students and to future employers, parents. I mean, we just don't have a way of marking this as an important part of what an undergraduate education has looked like for just the now thousands of students who have been involved in this program, including transfer students. So at one point, people said, oh, well, this is not going to be for transfer students. They don't have the time to do this kind of, as if this is kind of fluff. This is just sort of window dressing. But the argument that program has made is that, no, again, right, this can be the center of an education. And for transfer students, it might be even more important for them to be engaged in that style of learning. So absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge fan of us doing a better job structurally and administratively, of tracking that kind of learning.
It's our best example right now, Earl, of what you might be talking about in that last year. If you can imagine this very broad beginning that lays a base, then you do some work in the disciplines to get some depth, and then you're ready to put that to work in some way. And what they've done is to create a structure that adds the part that doesn't happen in class, right? It adds the kind of ability to envision a future that's different. It trains people in the skills required to execute that, how to work together in a team of diverse talents and backgrounds, how to develop consensus adequate to move together in a forward kind of way. The other place I see this happen a lot on campus is less formal and maybe more formative for students. And I just want to bring this up because I think it's a part of what some of our most effective graduates take away, and it's student activism. So unformalized action for change, often in our own community, but sometimes directed to the outside community. Some of the most remarkable Michigan graduates I know gained those skills in actually trying to change us.
Yeah.
And so I've been toying with what does it mean? What would it mean? Is it possible for an institution to frame or encourage its students to engage in activism? Could that ever be authentic if we encouraged it? So I don't know if anyone has thoughts about that.
I'll just say really briefly, and I want to monitor my airtime and not take up too much space. But one of the most short-sighted decisions I think I ever made was to deny a request from a student to get academic credit for protesting the university and some of its policies. I think we could have worked that out. I think we should have worked that out. I think by that point I was starting to get a little bit worn down by being yelled at all the time and didn't then want to kind of have to think creatively about how we would make something like that happen. But, I think back on that quite often, and I think we should have been able to think about that in a kind of project-oriented way with particular kinds of parameters, but at the heart of it was protesting and trying to change the institution.
Tim, when you raised that point, I actually had a flashback moment to a group of students sitting in my office when I was the provost at Emory. And I kept repeating to myself, I want them here. They ought to be here. If they don't believe they can change the world between ages of 18 and 23, we're all doomed. But I remember just having to repeat that to myself as they just sat there and sat there and sat there, and we're trying to make some headway so they could go home and I could go home. And eventually it worked out, but I did walk away. And I remember saying to my colleagues, if we're doing our job well, they should be there. They should actually be pushing us. And I still remember we were so flat-footed when it came to technology. They came with their own sort of crews, taking videos and had them up on the web and all. And our communication VP was like 3 years behind by the time. And so they crafted a narrative and were presenting the narrative, and we were always in reactive mode. And there was a part of me that was sitting back laughing. I mean, I was just laughing at us for being so bad at this, and in a way how our students were teaching us. But then at the same time, I still remember the other side of it, and this goes back to the idea of a class. I had a group of students at the end of this who had violated university rules. But they also didn't want to have to pay the consequences. They said, we don't want to go to jail. And I remember sitting there going, okay, this is interesting, going back to ethics, moral dilemma. And one of my theology colleagues got up and he says, look, there's a whole long history here in moral theology about engaging in change and actually being prepared to suffer the consequences for doing so. If we rob them, in his words, if we rob them of that experience, we also rob them of their place in history. So it's to understand that sometimes you want to take a stand in this way. So it's this interesting way where a group of students led to a whole series of events, including pressuring the provost to think deeply about his commitment to all of this, but also forcing faculty to opine in a real serious way about what are the ethical principles for engaging in a certain kind of activism and what should be the consequences, pro or con, for that kind of engagement. That was healthy for our community, and it was a learning moment for all of us.
Yeah, I think there's a thing in this, and I want to try to figure it out. We'll see what we can come up with. I want to make sure we take some time to answer some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. So let me bring forward one now. What do the panelists think about common aspects of the challenges of racism and inequality and environmental crises? And can we design educational experiences that address all of these challenges simultaneously, perhaps because they arise from the same widespread biases or misunderstandings? And Brahmar, can I ask you to talk about what you think about this, this connection among all these topics?
So, for me, I have this lens of data, right? That how do you actually evaluate data and the objectivity and principled way of evaluating data without biases. That's cross-cutting all disciplines, right? So many universities have come up with this data science.x, where you can actually major in data science, but then apply it to different domains, even with history. So they have partnerships, so they have a hub and spoke model with that. And so I think that if you are looking at it through the lens of data, and then you think about, you question, you really think historically, but then act in a systemic way to solve these problems. And I think there is an objectivity and evaluation associated with this. And I think that interdisciplinarity is very, very much lacking from our education. And when students see us getting excited about our research, it's most often like, we are working on problems in a team, and they don't get to see that fire, that passion in their classroom. So I run a summer program with about 50 undergraduates coming each year to Michigan from all across the world, and they are actually much better at this data. And they were born with laptops and iPads in their hands. So this is a different generation we are talking about. So the innovative things that they could do in terms of visualization, communication, these are, I feel like, cross-cutting skill sets which can help you see the reality in a much more palpable and compelling way. And they destroy our servers like multiple times, but they are fearless. They are brave in we throw them with complex electronic health record data, and there are all kinds of biases in terms of racial diversity and racial disparity question and causal inference. They learn so much because you give them a problem that motivates them to learn the causal inference, to learn the mathematics. So if they can see the problem that I want to address in a more principled way without biases, I think it's just completely game changing and paradigm shifting. And they are actually working in their dorms till 1 o'clock and sending us messages. So this is something I feel like we are missing from the standard curriculum, this joy of answering a question with my disciplinary expertise in a team.
Yeah. So the connections among these questions seem to me both in content. All of these challenges interact with one another, but also in the nature of the skills that students need to be able to address them. Again, partly breadth. They need to know something about a broad array of things, but then they also need to have the kind of skills that let them become the sort of change agent we want them to be, and the habits of mind to do that too. There's a question here about the fact that some of these issues are not new. And before I phrase the question, I want to raise something I was thinking about getting ready for this that unsettled me, let's say. We make the claim that liberal arts education, that that elite universities prepare people to be change agents in the world and to create the kind of future we want to have. But there is one piece of evidence that really argues against this, which is that almost all of the world's powerful elites have been educated in our institutions. And the conditions we face today were created by our graduates, right? And granted, they're not all what we would call classic liberal arts graduates, but it is the case that we had our chance to educate the people who are currently creating a lot of the problems that we face in the world. So I think there's, in addition to what we might want to do that's new in the future, we have to think a little bit about what we've been doing that's wrong and problematic. And I think that, in my own sense, is a lot of that's related to very disciplinarity. So the question that was raised, though, is that several of these issues are not new. And in light of the variety of backgrounds and experiences that we have here, the group of us, what surprising points of resistance to this idea of liberal education have you encountered? So we've all talked a little bit here about how not everyone knows that liberal education is good. What are some of the points of challenge that are most interesting, perhaps?
Let me offer one that has not been suggested so far. So I just finished a 12-year cycle as a trustee of my alma mater, the last 2 years as the board chair. And so that was illuminating in many different ways. But among the ways that I learned is the degree to which there is not necessarily a total agreement on, one, the value of the liberal arts, even for those who actually serve on the boards of liberal arts institutions. I mean, there's a way in which, as people have left, they want to now have the institution look, in some ways, reflect their own personal histories. And so they will side with this major or this school or this area of study and wanting to redirect, in some ways, revenue structures and opportunities there. And that's a fact. There are some who may understand the demographic transition that the United States has always been going through, and that will culminate by 2044, according to demographers, in a non-white majority. But for at least from some of my friends in Western Minnesota, that's not something that makes them sleep well at night. It brings them great unease because they actually don't know how to position themselves in the world where they won't be in the majority. That comes and shapes then conversations about how you design an institution and its future. And also there's a governance piece that also I think we should just put on the table, and I'll just end there, in addition to the curricular matters and the structural matters that we have been talking about here until this point.
Tim, I don't want to address, oh, go ahead, Angela.
No, go ahead.
I'm going to go off on a segue, so please.
Oh, well, I'll just piggyback on that to say that one of the things that always surprises me, or did, especially in my years in the dean's office, was the fixity of the structures that we've inherited and how difficult it turns out to be able to navigate them. And so I was often struck by how much time I spent trying to go around things that were already created, right? That the creativity, turned out to be a little subversive all the time. That, we had to call it a pilot if we wanted to, change the nature of an honors thesis, or, we had to kind of disguise the fact that we were trying to do things with courses that might involve students in delivering instruction a little bit more, or, the amount of time trying to figure out how to get around the things that were us. So the kind of that we're sort of in our own way and thinking beyond some of what we've inherited. I think, not only from boards, but, from members of our own faculty, and in some cases, members of the student body who are very unsettled by some of the kinds of changes that are being proposed.
Yeah, I just will piggyback on that, that there's a real resistance to changing the type of education that we provide, even among the faculty, and often they're thinking about their graduate students. And we have to educate our undergraduates so that we then have graduates, students that we can recruit. But there hasn't been a rethinking of what graduate education is and whether that is actually, the type of students that we're recruiting are actually the types of students that make the best graduate student. So there is a lot of resistance. I wanted to make a point about the previous question about the commonality between these different themes. And I think there's two themes that I think permeate all three of them. One is power, whether it's white power, whether it's corporate power. And so we can see all of this through that lens. The other one is respect and perspective, and gaining respect for other people, other cultures, respect for your environment. And I think that that's something that the liberal arts colleges really can do and need to do more of, which is getting students out of their comfort zone and having them meet new people, having them go new places. When I think about climate change and I think about who cares about climate change, oftentimes I'm like, well, it doesn't surprise me that some people don't care. They've never seen a glacier. They've never been out of a city. But when you move the students to those places, when you give them those experiences, they care a great deal. So that's the climate perspective, but we need to give them a perspective on inequality and racism as well, of course.
And I just want to add to that point that since we are talking about global challenge, there is this cultural supremacy that, you can only learn certain things from the West and apply it to the East or low middle income countries, but that often really prejudices us that there are many innovative techniques that are being adopted in LMIC countries as well, even with the pandemic, that we are not willing to learn because we are sort of like, we are prejudiced that this is the knowledge flows in one direction. And the same thing that these three issues are very common in terms of a global level for scientists, but there is a cultural context which is across the world very different. Like if you're thinking about air pollution in India and the air pollution in China and air pollution in the United States, if you don't know the history, that crop burning is one of the main reasons in India. So all of these pieces, that how can you understand the commonality and the science behind this and techniques for this challenge, but also flexible enough to adapt to a cultural and historical context so that you can actually offer a solution for that particular country. So I think the global perspective is very important for these challenges.
Along those lines, I once proposed to a group of liberal arts college presidents that they should think of instituting a requirement for all their students who have the ability to do so, to ensure that if they weren't excluding those who may be DACA students, but that you couldn't actually go from your freshman year to your sophomore year without getting a passport. And that indeed, the college should actually pay for it in a way as sort of part of making sure that you can think of yourself as having the right and freedom to travel the world to see it. Is that for a lot of particularly low-income students, the first hurdle is a passport to actually get it. To get it. So what if we actually make that part of the written-in experience for all of our students who have the status to be able to do so? That in and of itself could begin to then lead to the next set of questions about, then I now have it, where do I go?
Now, I love it when people propose programs that we actually have already.
Yeah.
So we do have a passport program at Michigan that helps to support the obtaining of. Very successful, and I think it does. It's a funny thing, but those kind of official documents carry weight in people's minds and self-conception. Great. I want to turn to another question that we have, and I think it's a deep one that maybe relates to my point about my wondering about whether we might be doing something really wrong and whether the existing circumstances. The liberal arts education.
Hey,
Who
Tim,
we bring into the institution.
you went out. We couldn't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me again now?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back a little bit. So it's a question about who gets to be educated in a liberal arts institution, in an elite university really of any kind. So this questioner says that one way to think about excellence is exemplifying a set of traits that are representative or definitive of the type. And as we move beyond things like GPA as a proxy or a measurement of excellence and begin to think about some liberal arts 2.0, how will we think about merit or excellence in a system like that? The first place we do that, of course, is at admission, and we decide who's going to get access to our institution. But then also as our students move through, we have these systems of validation and valorization that shape their experience so strongly that whatever we might say we want, they do what is valorized in that way. So what role might changing our metrics of consideration play in changing the way we impact the future of the world? Thoughts about this?
I think it's a really important question. I'm not sure that I have kind of a ready-made answer to it. I think part of an answer has to be about institutions, especially public ones, really stepping back and asking ourselves what we think we're doing and why. When it comes to who are we educating and under what conditions. I think part of it is a recognition that institutions like the University of Michigan aren't college for the vast majority of college students in the world. They aren't at institutions like ours. And so I think part of it might be thinking alongside of not institutions that aren't as competitive as a place like Michigan, community colleges. I mean, I think, one of the big moral questions of our day is that so many of the people who start at 2-year institutions with the intent to transfer to 4-year institutions, the vast majority aren't able to do so. And, that's about a lot of things that happen in people's lives. But there's also things that we're doing that constitute barriers to people being able to get to institutions like this successfully. So I think that this is a sector question. It's a landscape question. And I think part of it, maybe a beginning of it is, for people like us at Michigan to stick our heads up a little bit more and to be more aware of what the landscape that our institution operates inside of actually looks like, not only nationally, but internationally.
There's a way if we may need to change the starting assumption. So if we start with the assumption that talent is evenly distributed and access to opportunity is not. And so the question then becomes, what do we do to actually broaden that access to opportunity? And what ways can we, to Angela's point, what ways can we replicate what's being done elsewhere, but what ways may be unique to the University of Michigan? So this morning, you may have seen, as an example, the Washington Post ran a piece on Morehouse College, historically Black college in Atlanta, Georgia. And Morehouse has decided, and it's going out and trying to identify students who started, but who didn't finish, who had enough credits. They figure out now, can they actually use online as a tool and a mechanism to allow those students to actually finish and earn their degree. And working with them saying, okay, you don't have to come back in residence. We have some knowledge of who you are. We understand how close you were or how far away you were from realizing your goal, but we think we can actually design an experience that allows you to become a college graduate. That's the case of talking about and thinking through that talent is evenly distributed, is access to opportunity that's not, and developing then a program and a course of action that is unique to their own story, but actually could be replicated in scale. And so Georgia State, to me, which is my sort of poster child for all of this, when Mark Becker, who used to be here in public health years ago, when Mark became president of Georgia State, one of the things they decided they were going to do is twofold. One, increase the overall graduation rate, and then also eliminate all racial disparity in graduation rates. And they did so. They ended up designing, and in the same time, they took on the 2-year college, Georgia Perimeter, as part of the Georgia State system. but they design a algorithm and a set of metrics that allow them to figure out over the course of 3, 4, 5, 6 years, where were people falling out and how to then activate the system to actually make sure they stayed in and all. But it's this case where if I have one complaint about higher education, we study a whole lot of other people far better than we study ourselves.
I could not agree more. And I would like to add that, we have been very risk averse as who we actually admit and who we train. And we are not taking risk on people. I just feel that it's not distributed. Why not take chances on some people? And why even in like graduate school, we see all of these standardized tests, all of this focus on GPA, but why not take chances where you'll actually make the best gradient? People, we are really taking very solid students and continue to be solid, but then why aren't we reversing that? And why aren't we aligning our matrix to who we want here and what do you want to teach them and how do you want to evaluate them? We're always talking about the system and inertia, but who is the system? You have deans and provosts and everybody here on this call. Why aren't we the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one answer to that always has to be because we don't want to. Some global we just doesn't want to do those kinds of things.
Meanwhile, a number of college, particularly liberal arts colleges, moving to test optional and changing the ways in which they think about the overall landscape, which is having a seismic impact, at least for the testing industry, as it thinks about the future. I once asked an admissions officer, or the head of admissions at Emory, if we couldn't rely on the SAT, the ACT, could we fill the class? And I remember he looked at me and said, "Oh yeah, of course we could." And I said, "So then why are we relying on them if we can fill the class without relying on them?" It was the counterfactual that was in there. And he just looked and said, because everyone else is. I mean, it was the default in a way. And there is sort of the circular logic that gets caught up in as we try to figure out how to affect change.
Mm-hmm.
So we live in a moment when almost all of those unquestioned standard ossified norms about what constitutes eliteness have just been exploded. We know that we don't actually have to give students grades for them to come to class and learn things. We know that we don't have to use test scores to admit students to our campus. There's at least an existence proof that we could reach students all across the globe reasonably effectively if we chose to do that, right? We do feel we've lost something enormous, of course, in the last year, and we want to get a lot of that back. But if we don't use this opportunity to create some forward momentum on the kinds of change that we're talking about, it would be quite unfortunate. So we are beginning a process of really thinking seriously about that in the college. And one of the things that I'm wondering about a lot right now, so I want to finish with a quick question about this topic, is how do we draw out all of the experience and wisdom that is present to answer these questions? There's some evidence, for example, that deans and senior professors are not very good at redesigning the institution. Right? We've had us for a long time, we haven't done it. So, who would you suggest that we turn to in addition to folks like ourselves, who I love all of us, but who should we be speaking to in our community to draw insight into how we might change it? How should we speak to students, to staff, to alumni maybe? Where would you advise that we look for more insight beyond the kind of insight we get on a panel like this?
So I think for me, it's throwing open the doors and welcoming in the energy that was harnessed over the summer. I mean, the mass marches, the kind of nascent movements that we witnessed over the summer were historically larger than the vast majority of protests that came before it. I mean, I think that the enormity of what happened over the summer, I think harnessing that, welcoming it in, it's coming to your campus whether you like it or not. But I just think that that's going to be clear once we're back in residence. So, kind of opening the doors wide open to it, bring it inside and, kind of use it to think through some of the kind of connective things that we might want to create despite structures that don't lend themselves to those kinds of connections well. But I mean, I think using that energy, that desire, that critique, that momentum, strikes me as a really important thing to do.
I think this is a really difficult question because it's structural, and if you think about our students, they're coming out of a high school system that is structural and has its own issues, and then they're marching through a college system and they're experiencing it. So and then they go through the college experience and then they become alums. So if your question is who has the fresh take, that's a good question, because it's not clear who has the fresh take and who can expose it. I certainly wouldn't look at faculty members because they've gone their entire career through this system. I was going to answer students, but or recent grads, but I don't think that they have a good perspective. So there's a non-answer for you.
So I'll give 3 quick categories. One, that there may be a handful of other colleges and universities, some that the University of Michigan actually pays attention to, others that they actually never pay attention to, and that actually may, in a way, offer suggestions, if not a blueprint, for thinking about how to restructure and what that means. 2, there are people who are out there who are seeking to change us. And so the ASU GSV annual conference on global tech and higher education tech and the change, I actually would talk to those people who keep thinking that they're going to create some new whatever to change us, because some of them I met and they actually have interesting ideas, well, even when I disagree with them. So that may be a place. And then the last part, I hear Chris's point, although I actually think recently minted PhD students who are in that space between having recently been an undergraduate student and then a graduate student, and some percent of them imagine they're going to be a professor, would be an interesting cohort of folks to actually talk to, because they have a series of memories that sort of layer on top of experiences that actually could be quite effective and helpful for us.
So I hear this hesitancy about students. What I like about working with people at different levels on these questions is they see different things. What is invisible to us is very visible sometimes to students. Like, they might tell you that high stakes timed examinations are just torture. And when we say they're not, we're actually wrong. They're the ones experiencing the torture. They know it's torture. So they have something to contribute, not the whole system, perhaps. I think you're really right, Earl, about the idea of recent PhD grads, because they're experts in the education system. They just went through it. They're not recipients of all of its valorization and rewards yet. So they're in a position to provide some really serious critique. Maybe young faculty as well might be a powerful tool. So I want to thank you all very much for participating in this conversation, both those of you who are here on the screen with us, but also those of you who are at home watching this. I hope that if any of you have further ideas, you won't hesitate to reach out to me so that we can continue this kind of conversation. We will be continuing this seminar series with some more events this year, and then we also intend to continue it with a sequence of events next year as well. So look forward to some continued conversation about change around higher education, around liberal arts education, and especially around this thinking of how is it we prepare students to live in a world different from the one we lived in. We got the break of not needing to really, well, we should have done something about it, but we didn't actually have to do something about climate change yet. They're going to have to. And so how do we prepare our students to be ready to feel confident in their readiness to engage in those topics? That's one of the big questions for us to settle in the next few years. So again, thank you all very much. We'll bring this to an end so you can all get off to your dinners or whatever it is that you have to do next. And see you again in a few weeks when we have our next symposium.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.